The air inside the truck stop was thick with the scent of fried food and diesel fumes, the kind of place where the coffee was always hot, and the regulars all had stories to tell, most of them true, some of them stretched over the years like worn-out leather. Jack Harrison sat in his usual spot at the counter, his fingers wrapped around a ceramic mug that had seen better days. He wasn't here for conversation, wasn't here for much of anything, except a quiet moment to himself before hitting the road again. The hum of the neon sign outside flickered against the window, its reflection bouncing off the chrome edges of the jukebox in the corner. The place was quiet, too quiet. A handful of truckers sat scattered in the booths, most of them with their heads down, focused on their plates or their phones. The waitress, a kind-faced woman named Maggie, moved between the tables with the kind of efficiency that only came from years of doing the same job every night. Jack liked this place. He liked Maggie. She reminded him of people he used to know, good people, the kind that didn't deserve trouble. And that's exactly what was about to walk through the door. The roar of motorcycles split the silence outside, the kind of sound that made people sit up just a little straighter, the kind that signaled bad news long before it ever stepped inside. Engines cut out, leaving behind a heavy silence, and just like that, the whole truck stop seemed to hold its breath. Jack didn't turn around. He didn't need to. He'd heard that sound before. Different countries, different circumstances, same brand of trouble. The door swung open, and two men walked in like they owned the place. Leather vests, heavy boots, the smell of cheap cologne barely masking the stench of sweat and gasoline. Their patches read Iron Serpents MC, a name Jack had heard murmured by truckers in passing. Biker gang, drug runners, enforcers, the kind of men who built their reputation on making others afraid. They weren't just stopping in for a late-night meal. The taller one, with a face like sun-baked leather and cold, calculating eyes, took his time looking around. He had a thick, graying beard that made him look older than he probably was, but there was nothing slow about the way his eyes scanned the room. A predator, sizing up his next meal. His partner, younger, leaner, with a snake tattoo that coiled up the side of his neck, cracked his knuckles as he walked in, making a show of stretching his arms like he was warming up for something. Jack had seen their type before. Maggie's smile faltered the second she laid eyes on them, but she didn't let it slip all the way. "Help you boys with something?" The taller one smirked. "Yeah," he said, his voice like gravel. "We're here for business." Jack took a slow sip of his coffee. He knew exactly what was coming next. Maggie hesitated, her hands tightening around the coffee pot she was holding. Jack saw the shift in her expression, the way her eyes darted to the cash register for just a fraction of a second, then back to the men in front of her. She wasn't new to this game. She knew exactly what they were here for. The taller one leaned on the counter like he had all the time in the world, flashing a grin that didn't reach his eyes. "Heard this place does good business. Busy all the time. Lot of truckers stopping in, lot of money moving through." Maggie didn't answer right away. Jack could hear the measured control in her voice when she finally spoke. "We get by." The younger one, the one with the snake tattoo curling up his neck, let out a slow chuckle. Getting by ain't enough these days. Not with all the problems businesses like this can run into. He moved toward the row of booths, running his fingers along the back of a seat, his boots scuffing against the tiled floor. Health inspectors get real picky. Equipment breaks down. Supplies don't show up when they're supposed to. A lot of things can go wrong. Jack watched as one of the truckers, a middle-aged guy with a tired face and a name patch on his shirt that read Wayne, shifted in his seat. He kept his head down, but his jaw clenched tight. Everyone in the room knew what was happening. The taller biker tapped a slow rhythm on the counter with his fingers, pretending to admire the laminated menu in front of him. "What we're offering," he continued, "is a little peace of mind. Make sure none of those problems come your way." Maggie's smile was tight now, the kind of smile someone wears when they're trying to keep from showing fear. "I appreciate the concern," she said carefully, "but we don't need protection." The snake-tattooed biker let out a whistle. That's a shame. He turned toward a nearby booth where a father sat with his young daughter. The girl, maybe 7 or 8, was poking at a piece of pie with her fork, oblivious to the tension in the room. The father, however, had gone stiff. He shifted slightly, positioning himself between the bikers and his daughter. Snake grinned. Be a real shame if something happened to a nice family-friendly joint like this. Hate to see someone get hurt. Jack set his coffee cup down. He had been content to sit back and let Maggie handle things, let her try to talk her way out of it. But now they were bringing civilians into it. That changed everything. The taller biker must have sensed the shift in the air because he glanced at Jack for the first time. The look was quick, a passing glance, like he was sizing up an afterthought. An old man drinking coffee at the counter, nothing to be concerned about. Jack waited a beat, then turned slightly in his seat, just enough to face them. His voice was calm even. The lady said she's not interested. Silence. For a second, the only sound in the diner was the low hum of the jukebox and the distant rumble of an engine out on the highway. The tall biker, Jack pegged him as the leader, slowly turned toward him. His grin returned, but now it was laced with something colder. You got a problem, old man. Jack held his gaze, expression unreadable. Not yet. Snake let out another chuckle, but it was different now. Less amused, more irritated. Listen, Grandpa, I don't know who you think you are, but you're going to want to keep that mouth shut. Jack took another sip of his coffee. Or what? Snake's grin widened. Or we're going to have a problem. Jack exhaled slowly, shaking his head. You already got one. The leader frowned, clearly not used to people talking back to him. He stepped in closer, trying to loom over Jack, trying to intimidate him. That right? Jack finally set his coffee cup down for good, resting both hands on the counter. His posture was relaxed, casual even, but his eyes were sharp, focused, the way a wolf's eyes are just before it lunges. You think you're the first thug to walk into a place like this and try to scare people? Jack said, his voice steady. You think flashing some patches on your vest and throwing around threats makes you dangerous? He let the words hang for a second before adding, You have no idea what dangerous looks like. Snake's expression darkened. He took a step forward, his hand drifting toward his belt. I think it's time you... Jack moved. Not fast, not yet. Just a shift, barely noticeable. But it was enough. Enough to put him in the right position. Enough to tell anyone watching that the next move wasn't going to end well for the bikers. The leader must have sensed it too because he hesitated. Snake, on the other hand, was too stupid to realize what was happening. Make a choice, Jack said, his voice dangerously low. You can walk out that door and get on your bikes, or you can push your luck. But if you do, you better be real sure you can finish what you start. Another moment of silence. Reaper, the leader, studied Jack more carefully now. He wasn't seeing just an old trucker anymore. He was seeing something else, something dangerous, something that had been in fights before, real fights. Then finally, Reaper smirked. But this time, there was no amusement in it, just calculation. He lifted his hands in mock surrender, stepping back. We'll be seeing you, old man. Snake shot him a look. We're just gonna let this... Let's go, Reaper said, voice sharp. Now. Snake hesitated, then huffed and followed him out the door. The air outside filled with the roar of engines as they mounted their bikes, but Jack didn't turn to watch them leave. He already knew how this played out. They'd be back, and next time they wouldn't be alone. The truck stop was silent long after the roar of motorcycles had faded into the distance. The kind of silence that wasn't really silence at all, more like the weight of something unfinished settling over the room. The air felt thick, like everyone inside was waiting for someone to say something, waiting for the moment to break. Maggie let out a slow breath, the tension leaving her shoulders, but her hands were still shaking as she reached for the coffee pot. Jack, she murmured, barely loud enough for him to hear. What did you just do? Jack didn't answer right away. He picked up his coffee cup, took a slow sip, then set it down again. Stopped a problem before it started. Wayne, the trucker who had been sitting nearby, shook his head. "I don't know, man. That didn't feel like stopping a problem, felt like pouring gas on it." Jack turned slightly, giving Wayne a measured look. "They were going to shake this place down whether I said something or not. Bullies don't stop until someone makes them." Maggie sighed, rubbing a hand across her forehead. "Jack, I appreciate what you did, but you don't know these guys. They're not just some small-time gang. They've got connections, muscle. The Iron Serpents have been moving in on truck stops up and down the highway for months, shutting places down, running people out." Jack nodded slowly. He had figured as much. This wasn't just about a couple of punks looking for easy money. This was an operation, and operations had leaders. "They ever been here before?" he asked. Maggie shook her head. "Not until tonight." "Then that means they're expanding," Jack said, almost to himself. "Testing new ground." Wayne leaned forward in his booth, lowering his voice. "They've been all over this stretch of the interstate. First, it was just petty stuff, stealing fuel, hijacking a few shipments. Then they started leaning on truck stops, diners, gas stations, places like this, asking for protection money. You say no, they make life real hard." Maggie's lips pressed into a thin line. "I heard about a place 2 towns over, family-owned diner. They refused to pay. One night somebody torched the place. Nobody hurt, thank God, but the message was clear." Jack's fingers tapped against his coffee cup. He had seen this kind of thing before, in different forms, in different places. He had watched small villages in the Middle East fall under the control of local warlords, watched entire towns back home get swallowed up by organized crime. The tactics were always the same: start with intimidation, move to violence, and keep going until nobody dares to stand up to you anymore. And now the Iron Serpents were trying to do the same thing here. Maggie let out another slow breath, then straightened, forcing a tight smile. "Well, thanks for sticking up for me, Jack, but you should get going. I don't want you caught up in this." Jack raised an eyebrow. "You really think they're just gonna forget about this?" She hesitated. "They'll be back," he said, not as a guess, but as a certainty. "And next time, they won't come in twos." Maggie swallowed hard, glancing toward the door like she half expected the bikers to already be standing there again. "Then I'll deal with it when they do." Jack studied her for a long moment. She was tough, stronger than she looked, but he also saw the flicker of fear in her eyes, no matter how much she tried to hide it. "You have cameras in the lot?" he asked. Maggie nodded. "Yeah, but they're old. I doubt they even caught anything useful." "Doesn't matter," Jack said. "When they come back, they're gonna want to make an example out of you. They'll do it outside so everyone can see. Probably bust up the place a little, maybe rough up a customer or two. They won't go straight to violence, not yet. They want to establish control first." Maggie shivered at how casually he said it, like he was describing the weather. "And you know all this how?" Jack didn't answer right away. He had never been the type to brag about his past, but there were times when people needed to know what they were dealing with. "I used to handle counterinsurgency," he said. "I know how guys like this work. I know how they think." Wayne let out a low whistle. "You military?" Jack nodded. "Was." Maggie studied him like she was seeing him in a new light. "What branch?" "Special Forces." Silence. Wayne exhaled. "Well, that explains a lot." Jack looked back at Maggie. "You got a way to reach the sheriff?" She gave a short, bitter laugh. "Sheriff? You think he's gonna help?" Jack frowned. "Why wouldn't he?" Maggie glanced toward the empty booth in the back corner of the diner, the one that used to be filled every other night by Sheriff Tom Grady. But he hadn't been around much lately, not since the Iron Serpents started making their presence known. "You think they haven't gotten to him already?" Maggie said. "I called the sheriff's office when I heard about the other places getting hit. You know what they told me? That I should just cooperate, that paying for protection might not be such a bad idea." Jack's jaw tightened. Corruption. He should have guessed. Small-town law enforcement didn't always have the resources to deal with organized crime, And when the money was good enough, some of them didn't even want to deal with it. "What about state police?" Jack asked. Maggie shook her head. "They're stretched thin. Even if they do get involved, it'll take them days to do anything." Jack nodded, absorbing all of it. The bikers were expanding, the local law wasn't going to help, and Crossroads Truck Stop was now officially on their radar. Maggie poured herself a cup of coffee, gripping the handle tighter than she needed to. "So, what now?" Jack glanced toward the window, his gaze lingering on the distant glow of headlights along the highway. "They'll be back," he said again. "And when they come, they'll be expecting fear. They'll be expecting people to roll over." He reached into his pocket, pulled out a folded-up piece of paper, and slid it across the counter. Maggie frowned, picking it up. A phone number. "If anything happens," Jack said, "call me first." Maggie hesitated, staring down at the number, then she nodded. Jack stood, dropping a few bills on the counter, more than enough to cover his meal. As he turned to leave, Wayne spoke up. "Hey, Jack." Jack paused. "You think you can take 'em?" Jack smirked. "I know I can." And with that, he walked out into the night, already planning for the fight that was coming, because it was coming. And when it did, the Iron Serpents were going to learn exactly what kind of mistake they had made. The tension in the diner shifted abruptly from simmering silence to the crackling energy of imminent violence. In a heartbeat, the casual menace of the bikers exploded into a full-blown confrontation. Before anyone could process what was happening, the younger biker's hand darted toward his belt, his fingers twitching near the concealed knife. In that split second, Jack's eyes narrowed, a flash of predatory focus that told everyone in the room that he was done waiting for trouble to escalate. Jack rose slowly, every muscle coiled with the precision of years spent in combat. His movements were deliberate and economical. As the knife glinted in the uncertain light, Jack's hand shot out, snatching the weapon away with a swift, practiced motion. The sound of metal scraping against the worn wood of the counter filled the diner, followed by a gasp from a nearby trucker who recognized the swift shift from threat to counterattack. The taller biker, whose smirk had begun to waver, lunged forward with a clenched fist. But Jack was faster. With the fluid grace of someone who had long ago learned that hesitation meant death, Jack intercepted the punch. His elbow connected with the biker's jaw in a clean, decisive strike. The force of the impact sent the man stumbling backwards, his face contorting in a mixture of shock and pain as he crashed into a row of chairs. The diner erupted into a mix of shouts and scattered clatters, chairs scraping against tile, dishes toppling from tables as Jack pressed his advantage. His voice, low and unwavering, cut through the chaos. "You picked the wrong fight," he warned, each syllable weighted with quiet determination. His tone was not just a threat, it was the promise of retribution. As the taller biker tried to recover, the younger one, now empty-handed and fueled by adrenaline, advanced with wild eyes. Jack, his instincts honed by decades of discipline, anticipated the move. He sidestepped the clumsy swing of the younger biker, letting the momentum carry him forward. In a seamless combination of grace and ferocity, Jack grabbed the biker's arm mid-swing and twisted it sharply, forcing the man into a compromise between balance and defeat. There was a moment when everything seemed to slow. Maggie's hands trembled at the counter, and even the truckers in the booths leaned forward, eyes wide in silent witness. In that suspended heartbeat, Jack's mind raced through scenarios honed by a lifetime of training. He recalled the countless drills, the relentless discipline of his past in the Special Forces. Every move now was an echo of that old life, a life built on precision and control. With one hand still controlling the younger biker's arm, Jack delivered a brutal knee into the man's midsection. The impact was immediate, and the younger biker crumpled, gasping for breath as he slid across the floor. The sound of his body hitting the linoleum was stark against the background of scattered noise and confusion. The taller biker, struggling to rise from his earlier blow, barked out a challenge. "You think an old man can take us on?" he roared, trying to rally his remaining strength. but his voice wavered as he attempted to regain control of the situation. Jack's eyes never left him, filled with the calm certainty of a man who had seen too much to be intimidated by a couple of tough guys. Jack stepped forward again, positioning himself between the biker and the rest of the room. "I don't have to take you on," he said quietly, almost as if speaking to himself. "I just have to make you understand." With a swift, practiced movement, Jack grabbed a nearby chair, using it as both a shield and a tool of persuasion. He knocked the chair aside with precise force, sending it clattering against a table and drawing the attention of every person in the diner. At that moment, the other truckers began to rise, emboldened by Jack's fearless display. They formed a natural barrier around him, their collective presence a silent vow of solidarity. It was as if the entire room had shifted from being a passive audience to an active part of the confrontation. The message was clear. If these men meant to take over the truck stop by intimidation, they would have to get past more than just one veteran. The taller biker's eyes darted around, realizing that his crew's aggressive advance was not going as planned. Even his partner, now writhing on the floor, could do little but watch as Jack's calm determination filled the room. "Back off," Jack warned once more, his tone leaving no room for misinterpretation. "You're not the first to try and bully your way in, and you won't be the last to learn the hard way." The biker hesitated, and in that brief pause, Jack capitalized. He moved with an almost effortless efficiency, one hand gripping the edge of the counter while the other extended to block another incoming swing. Every movement was measured, as if choreographed by a lifetime of experience in dealing with chaos. The clash of bodies and the sound of impact resonated throughout the truck stop. But amid the chaos, Jack maintained an unwavering focus. His eyes locked onto the taller biker, reading every micro-expression, every twitch of uncertainty. It was then that Jack delivered a final, decisive blow, a swift strike that sent the biker reeling, his face contorting in pain as he slumped against the counter. The diner, once brimming with tension, slowly began to settle into a heavy, anticipatory quiet. The aggressive energy of the bikers had been forcibly neutralized, replaced by a stunned realization among everyone present. This wasn't just an old man fighting for his pride. This was a man who would defend his home, his community, and his dignity with every ounce of strength he possessed. As the echoes of the confrontation faded, Jack stood there, steady and composed, with the message delivered clear as day. The Iron Serpents had learned a harsh lesson. Sometimes the fight doesn't start until you decide to stand up. And when you do, you might just turn the tables in ways you never imagined. The roar of the motorcycles had long since faded, but the tension still hung thick in the air like the last wisps of smoke after a gunfight. Inside the diner, silence reigned. Not the comfortable kind, but the kind that meant everyone was still replaying the last few minutes in their heads, trying to convince themselves that what they had just witnessed had really happened. Maggie stood frozen behind the counter, her knuckles white as she clutched the coffee pot like it was the only thing keeping her upright. Across the room, Wayne let out a slow breath, shaking his head as he rubbed his temple. "Jesus, Jack," he muttered, "I don't think they're gonna let this go." Jack had already settled back into his seat at the counter, his expression unreadable as he reached for his coffee. He took a slow sip, the warmth of the mug steady in his hands, then set it down with deliberate calm. "They won't," he said simply. His voice carried the kind of certainty that left no room for argument. "They can't." Maggie swallowed, glancing toward the door as if expecting the Iron Serpents to burst back through at any moment. "You really think they're gonna come back, even after all that?" Jack turned his gaze toward her, his expression softening just slightly. He could see the fear in her eyes, the worry she was trying to hide beneath a tough exterior. He respected that. "They don't have a choice, Maggie," he said. "They've built their entire reputation on fear. If word gets out that one old guy at a truck stop stood them down, every other place they're trying to muscle in on is going to start thinking they can do the same." Wayne grunted, shifting in his seat. So what? They'll roll in here with more guys? Bigger guns? Jack nodded. Probably. Maggie's grip on the coffee pot tightened. So, what the hell are we supposed to do? Jack exhaled slowly, glancing out the window at the highway stretching endlessly into the darkness. He had been here before, in 100 different places, under 100 different circumstances. It never changed. The enemy always thought that fear was their greatest weapon, that if they applied enough pressure, the people they targeted would crack, fold, and beg for mercy. But Jack had seen it the other way around too. He had seen men, good men, pushed past their breaking points, and when they decided they weren't going to take it anymore, that was when the real fight started. "They're expecting fear," Jack said at last, "so we don't give it to them." Maggie let out a humorless laugh. "That's a nice idea, Jack, but not all of us are former whatever the hell you were. Most of us are just trying to get through the day without getting our heads kicked in." Jack gave her a small, knowing smile. "You think I was always this guy?" He shook his head. "I've been scared before, Maggie. Plenty of times. Fear's not the problem. What matters is what you do with it." She stared at him, her lips pressed into a thin line. "And what are you going to do with it?" Jack leaned back slightly, crossing his arms. "We're going to get ready." Wayne frowned. "For what?" Jack's expression turned to steel. "For war." The next morning, the truck stop looked the same as it always had. On the surface. The sun rose over the horizon, bathing the diner in warm light, casting long shadows across the cracked pavement of the lot. The smell of fresh coffee drifted from inside, mixing with the familiar scent of fuel and asphalt. Trucks came and went, engines rumbling as drivers stopped for breakfast or refueling before hitting the road again. Everything looked normal. But it wasn't, because the people inside knew. Wayne wasn't just sitting around nursing his coffee. He was outside, talking to a group of drivers, some of whom had been stopping at crossroads for years. Truckers had their own network, their own kind of brotherhood. Word had already started to spread about what had happened the night before. Some had shrugged it off as just another biker gang looking for trouble, but the ones who had been around a while, they knew better. Inside, Maggie had replaced the old, outdated security cameras with new ones that actually worked. Carl, the local mechanic, had stopped by early, installing extra motion lights in the lot and setting up a small alarm system for the diner's back entrance. It wasn't much, but it was something. Jack had spent the morning making phone calls, not to the police. He had already written them off as unreliable at best, compromised at worst. No, he had reached out to people he trusted, old friends, men who had spent their lives driving rigs, but had once worn a uniform just like him. They weren't looking for trouble, but if trouble came to them, they wouldn't back down. By midday, a few of those old friends started showing up. Big Steve was the first to roll in, stepping out of his rig with the kind of presence that made people take notice. He was built like a damn freight train, his arms thick as tree trunks, his face weathered by years on the road, and even more years spent in places he didn't talk about. He didn't say much when he saw Jack, just nodded once, the kind of nod that said, "I heard. I'm here. Let's do this." Doc Wilson was next. Despite the nickname, he wasn't a doctor. He'd been a combat medic back in the day, and even though he hadn't worn a uniform in years, he still carried himself with that quiet confidence of someone who had spent a lifetime patching up people who should have been dead. Others followed. By late afternoon, the diner had more truckers in it than usual, and these weren't just any truckers. These were men who had seen their fair share of fights, who had been through hell and made it back in one piece. They weren't armed, they weren't looking for a fight, but they were present. That was the first battle won. Because when the Iron Serpents came back, they wouldn't just be walking into a diner full of scared people looking to back down. They'd be walking into something else entirely. Nightfall came slowly, dragging the weight of anticipation with it. Inside the diner, the conversations were quieter, more focused. Maggie moved behind the counter, pretending like it was just another night, but Jack could see the way she kept glancing at the door, how her fingers fidgeted just slightly when she poured coffee. Then, at exactly the moment Jack had predicted, the sound of approaching motorcycles filled the air. Not two this time, not four, more than a dozen. The headlights cast long, stretching beams across the pavement as they rolled into the lot, their engines snarling like wild animals. They didn't park in an orderly row like before. This time, they circled. It was a tactic Jack had seen before, a slow, deliberate show of force, meant to intimidate. Inside, nobody spoke, but Jack could feel the tension shift. Big Steve cracked his knuckles. Doc Wilson leaned forward just slightly. The other truckers adjusted in their seats, not reaching for weapons, not standing up, just waiting. The bikers had returned, and this time they weren't just here to talk. Jack flexed his fingers once, slow and deliberate. Let them come. Because what the Iron Serpents didn't know, what they couldn't have possibly understood, was that fear only worked if the other side was afraid. And nobody inside that diner was afraid anymore. The growl of engines filled the air like distant thunder rolling in before a storm. The vibrations rattled the diner windows, sending a chill through Maggie's spine as she turned toward the sound. The truck stop, usually a place of routine and familiarity, now felt like the setting of something far bigger, something dangerous. The bikers had returned, and this time they weren't just sending a message. Jack had been expecting them. He sat at the counter, a coffee mug resting between his fingers, but his focus was locked on the growing shadows outside. Through the diner's large front windows, he saw the headlights flickering in the darkness, bouncing off the chrome and steel of the approaching motorcycles. They weren't just parking this time. They were circling, slow, methodical, like predators sizing up their prey. Maggie gripped the edge of the counter, her knuckles white. "Jack," she whispered. "I see him," he said, voice calm, unreadable. Big Steve, sitting a few stools down, exhaled through his nose and rolled his shoulders. "They sure brought friends." Wayne, still nursing his coffee in the corner, muttered under his breath, "Damn vultures." One by one, the bikers dismounted, the sound of heavy boots hitting asphalt echoing in the night. The leader, the one they called Hammer, was the first to step forward. His leather vest stretched across his broad frame, his thick hands flexing like he was itching for a fight. Snake, the wiry one with a tattoo curling up his neck, stayed a few steps behind, his sharp eyes scanning the interior of the diner. They weren't alone. More bikers filed in behind them, their presence filling the lot with a menacing energy. There were at least 15, maybe more. Some leaned against their bikes, arms crossed. Others stood near the entrance, watching, waiting. Jack took another slow sip of his coffee, barely reacting. Then the bell above the diner door chimed. Hammer walked in first, the heavy scent of leather, gasoline, and bad intentions following him like a shadow. The others filed in behind him, boots scraping against the linoleum floor. The truckers didn't move. Big Steve kept eating, casually cutting into his steak like he hadn't noticed the gang of criminals standing feet away. Doc Wilson leaned back in his chair, eyes half-lidded, unreadable. Others sat still, but their bodies were coiled, ready. Jack set his mug down and turned his gaze toward the bikers. "Back so soon?" Hammer grinned, but it was forced. There was an edge to it now, a frustration that hadn't been there the night before. "Well, we were just in the neighborhood," he said, voice low, gravelly. "Figured we'd stop in, see how things were going." Jack didn't blink. "Things are going just fine." Snake stepped forward, resting a hand on the counter, tapping his fingers against the surface. "Real friendly spot you got here," he said, looking around. "Shame if it got unfriendly." Maggie's breath caught in her throat. Jack didn't flinch. He didn't move. But something in his posture shifted ever so slightly, something only a trained eye would notice. The slight straightening of his back, the way his fingers curled just a little more around the handle of his coffee mug. It was the kind of shift that came before a storm. "You're crowding the place," Jack said, tone flat. Hammer chuckled, shaking his head. "You got a funny way of talking, old man." Jack just stared at him. "You got a funny way of overstaying your welcome." The words hung in the air, thick and heavy. The biker's amusement flickered, replaced with something colder. Hammer's smile twitched. "See, that's the thing. We are welcome. This is our territory now, which means this little operation here," he gestured around the diner, "it runs through us. And if you got a problem with that," his voice darkened, "then we got a problem with you." Jack let the silence settle. He wanted them to feel it. Then, finally, he spoke. "The only problem I see," he said, "is that you think this place belongs to you." He leaned forward just slightly. "But you didn't earn it. You didn't build it. You just want to take. And you think a little intimidation is going to make that happen?" He let out a slow breath, his voice turning to iron. "You picked the wrong place." Snake scoffed. "Yeah? And what are you going to do about it?" Jack didn't answer. Instead, Big Steve stood up, then Doc Wilson, then Wayne. And then, like a slow-rising tide, every trucker in that diner rose to their feet. The bikers froze. It wasn't loud. There was no shouting, no chest-thumping, no threats. Just a quiet, undeniable shift in the air as the realization dawned. They weren't just dealing with one man. They were dealing with all of them. Hammer's smirk wavered just for a second. Jack saw it, the doubt creeping in. "You see," Jack said, his voice slow, measured, "you boys are real good at pushing people around, real good at making folks feel small." He tilted his head slightly. "But here's the thing about truckers, about veterans, about men who've been through worse than you can imagine." He stood up, and in that moment, he wasn't just an aging trucker. He wasn't just some old man in a roadside diner. He was something else entirely. "You can only push us so far." The tension was suffocating. Hammer's eyes darted around, seeing just how outnumbered they were. Sure, they had numbers, but they weren't ready for this, for men who weren't afraid. Hammer exhaled through his nose, then slowly lifted his hands. "All right," he said, backing up a step. "All right, we see how it is." Snake hesitated, clearly itching for a fight, but Hammer placed a firm hand on his shoulder. "Not now," he muttered. "Not now, but soon." They backed toward the door, their presence lingering like a storm cloud. "This ain't over," Hammer said, looking directly at Jack. "Not by a long shot." Jack didn't answer. He just watched as they walked out, the other bikers following suit. Then, just as they reached their bikes, Hammer turned and made one last promise. "You don't know what you've started, old man." Jack held his gaze. "Neither do you." The engines roared to life. And then they were gone. The silence that followed was heavier than before. Maggie let out a shaky breath. Wayne sat back down, rubbing his face. Big Steve just chuckled. "Well," he muttered, "that went well." Jack sat down, picked up his coffee, and took another sip. Then he said it again. They'll be back. And this time, they'd be bringing hell with them. The bikers were gone, for now. But nobody inside the diner was under any illusion that this was the end of it. Jack sat at the counter, his hands wrapped around his coffee mug, his thoughts already miles ahead. The air in the room was still thick with the kind of tension that didn't just go away. It lingered, like a storm hanging on the horizon, waiting for the right moment to break. Maggie finally exhaled, shaking her head as she wiped her hands on her apron. "Well, that was fun," she muttered, sarcasm barely covering the tremble in her voice. "Anybody else feel like maybe we should just close up shop and move to Florida?" Wayne let out a dry chuckle from his seat in the corner. "Wouldn't help. Guys like that, they don't stop just 'cause you run. They find someone else to shake down, someone else to lean on." He tapped his finger against the counter. "Only way to deal with men like that is to stand your ground." Jack took a slow sip of coffee, letting the words settle. Wayne was right. Running wasn't an option. Not for him, not for anyone in this place. Big Steve cracked his knuckles. "So," he said, voice steady, calm, "how do we handle this?" That was the question, wasn't it? Jack had been thinking about it long before the bikers had even walked through that door. He'd seen men like them before, back in the service, back when his job had been to root out threats before they had the chance to grow. He knew exactly how this played out if they did nothing, and he wasn't about to let it happen. "They'll be back," Jack said finally, "and next time they won't just be looking to intimidate." Maggie crossed her arms. "You sure about that? Maybe they got the message." Jack shook his head. "Men like that don't take no for an answer. We embarrassed them tonight. Hammer isn't going to let that slide. If he backs down now, it makes him look weak, and if he looks weak, someone else will take his spot." Wayne sighed, rubbing his temples. "So what? We wait around and hope they don't bring guns next time." Jack set his mug down with a quiet clink. "No," he said, "we get ready." A hush fell over the group. Doc Wilson leaned forward, resting his elbows on the table. "I assume you've got a plan?" Jack glanced around the diner at the faces staring back at him. These weren't just regular civilians. They were truckers, mechanics, veterans, people who had spent their lives on the road, who had been in tough spots before and had learned how to survive. He didn't need an army. He already had one. "It starts with information," Jack said. "We need to know everything we can about the Iron Serpents, where they operate, who backs them, and most importantly, how far they're willing to go." Wayne frowned. "And how exactly are we supposed to get that kind of intel?" Jack tapped his fingers against the counter, considering. "They're a gang, not a military unit. They have weak points. The trick is finding them." Big Steve grunted. "I might know a guy, trucker out of Oklahoma, had a run-in with these bastards a few months back. Said they were trying to shake down a fuel stop he was at. I'll give him a call, see what he knows." Jack nodded. "Good. Anyone else got contacts? Anybody who's dealt with these guys before?" Doc Wilson raised a hand. "I know a few paramedics who've had to patch up the aftermath of their fights. Could be worth asking around." Maggie still looked skeptical. "All right, so we gather information. Then what? We're still just a bunch of truckers and ex-soldiers against a gang that probably has more firepower than we do." Jack gave her a small, knowing smile. "That's where they're gonna make their mistake." She raised an eyebrow. "Oh, yeah. They think we're civilians," Jack said simply. "They think they can walk in here and take what they want because nobody's ever stopped them before." "And?" Wayne pressed. Jack leaned forward, his voice dropping to a near growl. "We show them they picked the wrong damn place." Silence. Then, slowly, Big Steve grinned. I liked the sound of that. The next morning, the real work began. Jack and the others wasted no time. They reached out to their networks, other truckers, mechanics, anyone who had ever crossed paths with the Iron Serpents. Information started trickling in. The gang wasn't just some local outfit. They had roots stretching across 3 states, operating out of small-town truck stops just like this one, protection rackets, drug running, weapons deals. And they had big plans. Word was, they were trying to expand their operations further north. That meant Crossroads Truck Stop was more than just another shakedown. It was a test, a warning. If they could take control here, it would send a message to every other business along the highway, which meant stopping them wasn't just about protecting the diner. It was about stopping something bigger before it even started. Carl, the mechanic, had been busy too. By midday, he had rigged up a few additional security measures, reinforced locks on the doors, a few hidden cameras in key locations. It wasn't much, but it was something. By nightfall, the truck stop had become a fortress. And then the real surprise arrived. Jack had made a few calls of his own, and those calls had been answered. Just before sunset, a new convoy rolled in. Not truckers, not regular customers, but veterans. Men Jack had served with, men who had seen more fights than they could count. Some were still truckers, others had moved on to different jobs, but they all had one thing in common. They knew how to stand their ground. Maggie watched as they climbed out of their vehicles, each one carrying themselves with a quiet confidence that sent a chill down her spine. Jack, she murmured, watching as more and more of them gathered in the lot. "What the hell did you do?" Jack smiled faintly. "Called in some old favors." Big Steve whistled low. "Damn. If I were the Iron Serpents, I'd start rethinking my life choices right about now." Wayne chuckled. "Yeah, well, they're not that smart." Jack turned, surveying the gathering crowd. "No," he said, "they're not." The sun dipped lower, casting long shadows across the pavement. The truck stop was quiet, but the kind of quiet that only came before something big. The kind of quiet that came before a war. Jack glanced toward the road, toward the long stretch of asphalt leading into the night. Any minute now, they would come, and when they did, they would realize they had made a fatal mistake, because they weren't just walking into a diner anymore. They were walking into a battlefield. The night stretched long over Crossroads truck stop, but no one inside was sleeping. The distant sound of motorcycles echoed somewhere out in the darkness, an ever-present reminder that the Iron Serpents weren't finished. They were watching, waiting, planning their next move. Jack sat at his usual spot at the counter, a half-drunk cup of coffee beside him, his gaze locked on the entrance. Outside, the parking lot was quiet, too quiet. The occasional truck rolled in, but the usual liveliness had been replaced with something else. The regulars knew something was brewing. They could feel it in the air. Wayne sat across from him, idly drumming his fingers against the tabletop. Feels like sitting in a foxhole waiting for the shelling to start. Big Steve let out a grunt from the corner. "Yeah, well, we're dug in. Let 'em come." Carl, the mechanic, walked in from the back entrance, wiping grease from his hands with an old rag. "Security's set up," he said, nodding toward Jack. "I reinforced the rear exit, and we rigged the side entrance so it locks from the inside. If they try to come in from the back, they'll be hitting steel." Jack nodded. "Good." Carl hesitated for a moment before stepping closer. "You really think they'll try something tonight?" Jack exhaled slowly, letting the silence hang before answering. "They don't have a choice." Wayne frowned. "What do you mean?" "The way Hammer operates, he doesn't let things go. If he doesn't hit back, he loses face. He already looked weak when we ran him off last time. If he lets us stand, other places might start thinking they can do the same." Jack took another sip of coffee, voice steady. "No, he'll come, and it won't be another warning." The words settled like a weight over the room. Beth, who had been silent behind the counter, finally spoke. "I called the sheriff's office earlier, told them what was going on." Jack turned to look at her. "And?" She shook her head, her lips pressing into a tight line. "They said they'd look into it, but we both know what that means." Everyone in the room did. The Serpents had money, influence, enough power to keep the law looking the other way when it suited them. If something went down at Crossroads, there was a good chance they'd be left to handle it alone. "Figures," Big Steve muttered. "Looks like it's just us then." Jack's eyes flickered toward the entrance again. "That's all we need." Another long silence. Then from outside the sound of an engine cut through the quiet. Low, deep, controlled, not a random trucker passing through. Everyone in the room froze, listening. The engine rumbled closer, then came to a stop. Boots hit pavement, then another, then another. Jack rose from his seat. "Here we go?" Carl swallowed hard. "You want me to—" Jack held up a hand, stopping him. "Wait." The door chimed. A man stepped inside, his presence filling the room like a storm front rolling in. He wasn't a biker, no leather vest, no patches, no gaudy rings or skull-covered tattoos, but he was dangerous. Jack knew it the second he laid eyes on him. The man was in his late 40s, maybe 50s, lean but strong, with sharp eyes that didn't miss a thing. He moved like someone used to being in charge, like someone who had never had to raise his voice to make people listen. The kind of man Jack had seen before, the kind that commanded armies. He didn't need to introduce himself. Jack already knew who he was. Diego Ramirez, the man behind the Iron Serpents, behind everything. Beth took an instinctive step back, her fingers gripping a coffee pot like it was a lifeline. Carl muttered under his breath, "Oh, hell." Ramirez stepped forward, surveying the room like a businessman assessing a property. He took his time, his gaze flickering to each face, each pair of watching eyes. Then he smiled. It wasn't warm, it wasn't friendly. It was a smile built on confidence, on absolute certainty that he owned the ground he walked on. "I hear you've been giving my boys some trouble," Ramirez said, his voice smooth, effortless. Jack didn't move, didn't blink. "And I hear your boys have been making a mess where they don't belong." Ramirez exhaled, shaking his head with mock disappointment. "You know, that's the thing about business. Expansion is inevitable. You either move forward or you get left behind." Jack tilted his head slightly. "This isn't a business. This is a town." Ramirez's smile widened. "And I own towns." The tension in the room was suffocating. Wayne, Big Steve, and the others held their ground, muscles coiled, waiting. Ramirez let the silence drag out before sighing. "I like to make things easy, Mr. Davidson. I don't enjoy unnecessary conflict. So I'm going to make you an offer." Jack didn't say anything. Ramirez continued. "You walk away. You tell your people to walk away. I'll even compensate you for the inconvenience." He reached into his suit jacket, pulling out a small envelope, and slid it onto the counter. Jack glanced at it, didn't touch it. Ramirez leaned in slightly. "I can be very generous." Jack met his gaze, steady. "And if I say no?" The smile didn't leave Ramirez's face, but his eyes darkened. "Then you make things difficult, and I don't like difficult." Jack exhaled through his nose. "You think fear is going to work?" Ramirez shrugged. "Fear is efficient." Jack finally looked down at the envelope. Then, without breaking eye contact, he reached out and slid it back toward Ramirez. Slow, deliberate. "No deal." Ramirez let the refusal hang in the air. Then, finally, he picked the envelope back up, tucking it neatly into his jacket. He straightened, adjusting his cuffs. "That's disappointing," he said, "but expected." He turned to leave, but paused at the door. "Tell me, Jack." His voice was softer now, more thoughtful. "How many people do you think you're responsible for in this place? 10, 20, more?" Jack didn't answer. Ramirez nodded to himself, as if deciding something. "Do you know what happens to men like you?" His eyes gleamed. "Men who think they can hold the line, who think they can stand up to something bigger than them?" Jack remained still. Ramirez's smile returned. "They end up being examples." And with that, he stepped outside. Jack followed him to the door, watching as he climbed into his SUV. The moment the vehicle pulled away, a second sound filled the night. The low, rumbling roar of motorcycles. One by one they emerged from the darkness. Not 10, not 20, 50, maybe more. Their headlights flickered in the night, chrome gleaming under the truck stop's floodlights. They didn't charge, didn't attack. Not yet. They just waited. A message, a promise. Jack exhaled slowly. Behind him, Big Steve muttered, "Well, we got our answer." Maggie's voice was quiet. "What now?" Jack turned, looking at the people around him. Good people. People worth fighting for. He cracked his neck, rolling his shoulders. "Now," he said, his voice like steel, "now we make sure they regret ever coming here." The roar of motorcycles filled the night air outside Crossroads truck stop, their engines rumbling like distant thunder. 50, 60, maybe more. A wall of chrome and leather surrounding the lot like a noose tightening around the neck of the quiet diner. Inside, the tension was thick enough to choke on. Jack stood at the counter, arms crossed, watching the headlights through the front windows. He wasn't surprised. This was always going to happen. The moment he had slid that envelope back toward Ramirez, the moment he had said no, this outcome had been set in stone. Wayne exhaled sharply, rubbing his jaw. "That's a lot of them." Big Steve, ever the calm one, just cracked his knuckles. We knew this was coming. Maggie stood behind the counter, arms wrapped around herself, her fingers white against her sleeves. What if they come in shooting? They won't, Jack said without hesitation. Carl let out a dry laugh. You sound pretty damn sure about that. I am. Jack didn't take his eyes off the motorcycles. Ramirez doesn't do reckless. He's a businessman. He needs control, order. Random gunfire in a public space brings the wrong kind of attention. Yeah, Wayne muttered, but his dogs don't have leashes. That was true. The Iron Serpents weren't cartel professionals. They were gang muscle, loyal, violent, and unpredictable. If Ramirez whispered in their ears that Crossroads needed to be handled, they'd take that as a green light for destruction. Jack turned to Big Steve. Everyone in position? Steve nodded. All exits covered. Doc Wilson's in the back with the others. We pulled the trucks up tight along the side entrance, so if they try anything, they'll have to funnel through the front. Good. Jack's phone buzzed. A message. You have 1 hour to reconsider. He showed it to Wayne. Wayne blew out a slow breath. They're playing games now. Not games, Jack said. Psychological warfare. They want us sweating. They want us to panic. Maggie's voice was small. It's working. Jack turned to her. Number, it's not. She looked at him, eyes filled with worry. Then what do we do? Jack glanced around at the others, at the faces of the people who had put their trust in him. We don't blink. The next hour crawled by. The motorcycles never moved. The riders never approached. They just waited. Every few minutes, an engine revved, sending a sharp growl through the night air. A reminder that they were still there, that they weren't going anywhere. Inside, the air was tight. Carl paced near the back, a wrench in his hands. Wayne sat near the door, checking and rechecking the position of the shotgun leaning against the counter. Maggie made coffee she knew no one would drink. Jack. Jack watched. He was waiting for them to get impatient. And then, just like that, the waiting ended. A single motorcycle peeled away from the pack, rolling toward the entrance. Hammer. He dismounted slowly, the worn leather of his vest creaking as he rolled his shoulders. He made a show of adjusting his gloves, then strode toward the front door. Jack stepped forward to meet him. Hammer grinned, his teeth yellow from years of smoking. Been a while since someone made us wait, he said, voice gravelly. Jack didn't smile. What do you want, Hammer? Hammer tisked. What do I want? Nah, man, that's the wrong question. The question is, what do you want? 'Cause I'm guessing you don't want that pack of bikes outside tearing this place apart. Jack didn't move. We're still standing. You didn't expect that, did you? Hammer chuckled, shaking his head. You know, I gotta hand it to you. Most folks, they fold when we apply pressure. You got a spine. He clapped a heavy hand against his own chest. And I respect that. Jack tilted his head slightly. But? Hammer's grin faltered. But you're on the wrong side of this. Jack narrowed his eyes. You're fighting against progress, Hammer continued. Ramirez. He's not some thug looking to burn this place down. He's got vision. He builds, expands. And you're a roadblock. Jack exhaled slowly. That's a real nice speech. Did Ramirez tell you to say it, or did you come up with it yourself? Hammer's jaw twitched. Jack pressed. You think Ramirez respects you? You think you're his equal? You're a tool, Hammer. A hammer does what it's told. When Ramirez is done with you, you'll be discarded. Hammer's lip curled. You got a real big mouth. And you've got about 30 seconds before I throw you out of this place, Jack said evenly. Hammer laughed, but there was no humor in it. All right. Here's the deal. Last offer. Ramirez says you walk away now, nobody gets hurt. That means you, your friends, your families, this place, we'll let it run. Under new management, of course. Business as usual. Jack said nothing. Hammer leaned in slightly. Or we come in. And when we do, we're not just coming for the diner. We're coming for everyone. You, The truckers, the old man in the corner. Hell, we might even pay Maggie's sister a visit down in Tulsa. Maggie stiffened. Jack's hands clenched at his sides. Hammer smiled. See? Now I got your attention. The room was deathly silent. Jack breathed in, then out, slow, measured, and then he spoke. You want to walk out of here in one piece, Hammer? This is your only chance. Hammer blinked. Then, for the first time, he really looked at Jack, at the way he stood, the way he held himself, and Hammer finally realized Jack wasn't some truck stop regular. He wasn't just a veteran. He was something else, something dangerous. Jack took a step forward. You think you scare me? You don't. You think you're the first gang I've dealt with? You're not. You think your threats are new? They're old. And you? Jack's voice dropped to a near whisper. You're a dead man walking. You just don't know it yet. Hammer took an instinctive step back. Jack didn't stop. You tell Ramirez that his time's up. You tell him that his operation is done. And if you don't, well... Jack's eyes gleamed cold. You won't have a chance to regret it. Hammer swallowed hard. For the first time, he was afraid. Your call, Jack said, voice calm. Hammer hesitated, then turned sharply on his heel and walked out. The door slammed shut behind him. He strode to his bike, climbed on, and gunned the engine. The other motorcycles watched, waited. Then, one by one, they followed. Within minutes, the lot was empty. Crossroads stood, still standing, still breathing. Jack turned back toward his people. Big Steve let out a breath. Well? Maggie wiped her hands on her apron. Now what? Jack exhaled. Now. He walked back to the counter, picking up his coffee. Now we get ready, because this wasn't over, not yet. The silence outside Crossroads truck stop was almost eerie after the Iron Serpents finally rode away. The deep rumble of their engines had been a constant, oppressive force for hours, but now that they were gone, the absence of sound was just as suffocating. Inside, the tension hadn't lifted, it had simply coiled tighter. Jack sat at the counter, fingers curled around his coffee cup, but he wasn't drinking it. He was thinking, planning. He knew what was coming next. Hammer had walked away, but not because he wanted to. He'd left because he had no choice. And men like him, men who thrived on intimidation, who built their lives on dominance, they didn't take humiliation well. No, this wasn't over. It was just beginning. Wayne exhaled loudly from his spot near the window. I don't like it. Big Steve grunted. Yeah, well, neither do they. That's why they backed off. Wayne turned, scowling. Backed off? You think that was them backing off? That was them reevaluating. Ramirez is too smart to throw everything at us in one go. He's going to step back, figure out what went wrong, and when he comes back, he shook his head. It's not going to be a damn show of force. It's going to be an execution. Jack finally took a slow sip of his coffee, then set the cup down. Exactly. Maggie stiffened behind the counter. You want them to come back? Jack met her gaze. Not want, need. Carl let out a low breath. Jesus. Jack continued. They thought they were walking into a simple takeover, but after tonight, they know this is different. That means they'll have to rethink their approach. That takes time, and time is exactly what we need. Beth, who had been standing quietly by the register, frowned. For what? Jack looked at her, to set the trap. By morning, Crossroads was a war room. Jack had spent the night making calls, some local, some to old friends who owed him favors, some to people who didn't owe him a damn thing but understood what was at stake. He wasn't going to fight this war alone. And when the sun rose, the first reinforcements arrived. It started with the truckers. Big Steve had called in some contacts from the long-haul community, men and women who had seen the road wolves operating for months, extorting truck stops, shaking down businesses, intimidating innocent people. They knew the patterns. They'd seen what happened when nobody pushed back. So they came, dozens of them. By mid-morning, the Crossroads lot was full of rigs, Big 18-wheelers parked in a strategic pattern, blocking off key entry points, controlling the flow of movement. They weren't just parked randomly, they were positioned. Defensive barricades disguised as normal business. By noon, the veterans started arriving. Jack had made one call to a man named Bishop, and that was all it took. Bishop was a former Marine, same as Jack, but his post-service work had taken him in a different direction. While Jack had built a quiet life on the road, Bishop had built a network, a coalition of ex-military retired cops, private security personnel, men and women who had spent their lives protecting others. And when someone like Bishop put out the call, they answered, they showed up. By the time the afternoon sun cast long shadows across the parking lot, Crossroads wasn't just a truck stop anymore. It was a fortress, a heavily reinforced, strategically defended no-go zone, and that was before the final wave of help arrived. Late in the evening, the sound of motorcycles rumbled down the highway. But this time, it wasn't the Iron Serpents. It was the Guardian Riders, a group of former military and law enforcement bikers who patrolled highways, stepping in when local law enforcement couldn't or wouldn't. They had no official jurisdiction, no government backing, but they had principles, and they had numbers. Jack watched from the entrance as the first wave of them pulled in. Their vests bore patches, American flags, unit insignias, some bearing the simple words, "Never Again," across their backs. Bishop approached Jack as the riders dismounted. Figured you could use a little extra muscle. Jack exhaled slowly. Yeah, I could. Bishop smirked. Well, now you got it. The tension thickened as night fell. Crossroads was locked down. Every entry point was covered. Every alley, every side road, every vulnerable position had eyes on it. Jack and Bishop stood near the entrance, going over final plans. They're going to come fast and hard, Bishop said. They have to. If they wait too long, word spreads and they lose all their leverage. Jack nodded. They'll try to overwhelm us. Flash attack, full force. Bishop smirked. Yeah, but they don't know what they're walking into. Jack glanced toward the trucks, the bikers, the veterans, the people inside who had banded together. Number they don't. Bishop tilted his head. What do you think Ramirez does when he figures it out? Jack's jaw clenched. He won't get the chance. Midnight. It started with the power going out. 1 second, the truck stop was bathed in artificial light. The next, darkness. But Jack had expected that. Within seconds, emergency floodlights kicked in, casting eerie white glows over the lot. Then came the sound of engines. Dozens, maybe more. The Iron Serpents were back. And this time, they weren't here to make threats. They were here to end it. Jack turned to Bishop. Let's go. They moved. Bishop's men spread out. The truckers held their ground. The bikers prepped for impact. Jack stepped forward as the first wave of serpents rushed the lot. They came fast, weapons in hand, chains, bats, knives, and they ran straight into a wall of resistance. The first man through got a boot to the chest that sent him flying backward. The second got leveled by Big Steve, a fist like a sledgehammer knocking him clean out. The third tried to run toward the entrance, but was met with Wayne's shotgun barrel. And from there, it was a battle, a brawl in the dark, fought with fists and grit. But there was one key difference. Jack and his people had planned for this. The Iron Serpents. They had walked into a trap. Within minutes, the tide turned. The bikers realized too late that they were outnumbered, outmatched. And then the sirens came, police, state troopers, feds. Everything Jack had set in motion was happening now. As the first squad cars screeched onto the lot, Jack turned toward the chaos and spotted Ramirez. Standing near the back, watching, Jack pushed forward. He wasn't letting him escape. He grabbed Ramirez by the collar just as the man tried to slip away. Ramirez froze. Jack's voice was low, dangerous. I told you. Your time's up. Ramirez's jaw clenched. His usual confidence shattered. You have no idea what you've done, he hissed. Jack's grip tightened. Yeah, I do. And as the red and blue lights flashed across the lot, as the iron serpents were taken into custody, as the empire Ramirez had built began to crumble before his eyes, Jack finally let go, because the battle was won.